I'm Laura Bennett, 32, and the text landed while I was looping a silver ribbon over the last branch of our small tree. This Christmas is only for Chelsea's kids. Don't come. I stared at those 10 words until the lights on the tree blurred, then typed a single reply. Okay, and set the phone face down on the table. Caleb was humming carols in the next room, arranging toy soldiers like a parade, unaware of the chill that message carried into our living room. By nightfall, the mountains outside our window vanished behind a curtain of snow, and I signed the final papers on a place no one in my family knew existed, a warm, glass-walled estate high above Aspen. I didn't plan a speech or an argument. I planned a table big enough for everyone they had forgotten. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to make your own place at the table, hit that like and subscribe so this story finds the people who need it. I grew up on the south side of St. Louis in a square little house shaded by a maple that flamed red each October, a house where everyone knew whose laughter was welcome and whose was too loud. My parents praised neatness, polished manners, and trophies that could be displayed. And Chelsea, 2.5 years younger, with careful curls and a dimple that worked like a key, fit their vision with ease. I learned to keep my room tidy, to help without being asked to earn my good quietly. I was the child who stayed up late with a library book and woke early to set the table. Grandma Pearl taught me the rest, how to mind my word, how to keep what you promised, even when no one is watching, and how kindness has a way of circling back when you least expect it. I didn't resent the rules. The house just ran on a rhythm that never seemed to include my name in the chorus. Money was always counted twice where I came from, and I understood it early. Hand-me-down coats, coupons clipped in stacks, careful lists for the grocery store. When I left St. Louis for Denver at 26, everything felt bigger and thinner at the same time. Wider streets, taller office buildings, higher rent, and fewer people who knew the shape of my days. The contrast pressed me into discipline. I kept 2 jobs, learned to code on an old laptop, and took on whatever freelance work I could find to keep us steady. There were months when I measured time in project milestones and grocery receipts, when the only new thing in our apartment was a thrift store lamp I cleaned until the brass shone. Through it, Caleb grew into a boy who said thank you to bus drivers and held the door for neighbors, and I held tight to the quiet values Grandma Pearl had planted. The fault line with my family didn't open in one dramatic instant. It lengthened year by year across small moments that shouldn't have mattered, but did. Chelsea drew attention without asking for it. Recitals, perfect pictures, the jokes my father repeated at barbecues. I learned the unpopular skill of waiting my turn and then learned there wasn't one, at least not for me, not at that table. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the habit of looking past the person who doesn't shine the way you expect. I became an expert at setting plates, refilling glasses, and moving along the edges of a room. When I built the first version of my software, lines of code written after bedtime notes taped to the fridge so I wouldn't forget a school form, the world beyond our apartment began to notice what my family didn't. Clinic managers returned my emails. A hospital administrator asked for a demo. A nurse wrote a message that I still keep saying a shipment arrived on time, and a patient got what they needed because of it. It wasn't glamour. It was function, quiet, and necessary, and for the first time, my work held a shape I could stand inside. But nothing I accomplished shifted the old pattern at home, and the distance between what I was building and what my parents believed about me stretched like a wire. I kept my successes small on purpose, not out of shame, but out of caution, because every announcement turned into a story about Chelsea, or a reminder to be careful about how things look. I stopped expecting applause. I stopped expecting much at all. The part of me that still wanted a word, a hand on the shoulder, a simple, "We're proud of you," shrank smaller each year until it felt like a pearl of grit I carried in my pocket. When Caleb asked why we spent Christmases driving back to St. Louis only to sit at the folding table with the cousins, I told him it was tradition, and he accepted it with the patience of a 10-year-old who trusts what his mother can't quite explain. The message about Christmas arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of gray afternoon when the sun thinks about setting by 4, and I felt an old ache surface like a bruise you thought had faded. I didn't argue, and I didn't beg, because the shape of my life no longer required both hands to hold their approval. I looked at our small tree, then at the contract on my kitchen counter, and decided that if someone closes a door you've knocked on for 3 decades, the wisest thing you can do is build your own threshold. I signed, breathed, and let silence do the job words had never done for me. The first memory that told me exactly where I stood in that house is one I can still smell: gingerbread and pine sap, the radio low, my father's camera flashing as ribbons curled at our feet. I was 15, old enough to wrap presents well, and young enough to believe that inside a box might be the proof I had finally been seen, and the room seemed to lean toward my sister, as if the furniture knew which way to face. My mother handed Chelsea a gift that made the air ring with delight, and my father lifted the camera again, laughing. A smaller package slid across the rug toward me, neatly tied with gray twine, and I remember the weight of it in my hands as I pulled the bow loose and looked up, hoping just once to find my name in the light. When I tore the wrapping paper from that box at 15, the whole room smelled of cinnamon and pine. Chelsea's new pink bicycle gleamed beside the tree ribbons, trailing from the handlebars, her laughter spilling across the room like music. I unwrapped a smaller box and found a gray wool scarf folded neatly inside. My mother smiled faintly and said, "It's cold out. I knitted this for you." Her voice was soft, but it carried that finality I'd come to know, the kind that ended conversation before it began. I thanked her and wound the scarf around my fingers, watching as my father took another photo of Chelsea posing beside the bike. The flash caught her hair, her dimples, everything they loved best. My own smile felt rehearsed, stretched thin under the weight of their joy. That scarf became my quiet companion for years. Every winter I wore it, not because it was warm, but because it reminded me where I stood. In that house, I was the shadow that moved along the walls, helpful, polite, invisible, when it mattered most. At the dinner table, I filled glasses and passed dishes, while Chelsea told stories that drew laughter and praise. Even when I won things school award scholarships, those moments slipped by with a polite nod before attention swung back toward her. It wasn't that anyone said I didn't belong, it was that no one had to. By the time I finished high school, I'd learned to measure my worth in silence. I worked 2 part-time jobs, applied for college loans, and planned my own future, while my parents spent their weekends driving Chelsea to piano recitals and debate meets. When I left for college, there were no tears, no big farewell dinner. My father loaded my boxes into the trunk. My mother reminded me to keep my grades decent, and Chelsea waved from the porch, smiling like she was already the star of the next story. I didn't cry. I simply promised myself that someday I would build something of my own, something no one could dismiss. At 22, that promise almost broke. I was newly graduated, working as a receptionist at a small clinic, and just beginning to feel like life might finally make sense. Then I missed a period, took a test, and the world tilted. The father, a man I'd dated for a year, listened to the news with a look that told me I was on my own. "I'm not ready for this," he said, and by the end of the week his number was disconnected. I went home with shaking hands and a heart that refused to believe my family would turn away. My mother listened without expression. My father stared at the floor. Then he said almost gently, "You can fix this. You're young. Don't throw your life away." I remember gripping the edge of the counter, realizing what he meant. When I told them I wanted to keep the baby, my mother's voice sharpened like glass. "Then you're doing it alone. We have enough responsibility with Chelsea. She's planning a wedding. She needs stability." That night I packed what I could carry and left. I rented a single room above a laundromat on the edge of town, peeling wallpaper, thin walls, the steady hum of dryers below. I kept the scarf folded in a drawer, but never wore it again. Those first months of pregnancy were a blur of fear and motion. I worked days at a diner, nights cleaning offices, and weekends stocking shelves at a grocery store. When my feet ached and my back screamed, I reminded myself that this child would never have to beg for a place at anyone's table. I ate peanut butter sandwiches at midnight and fell asleep with my shoes still on. Some mornings I woke to find tear stains on the pillow, though I couldn't remember crying. When Caleb was born that October, the air outside carried the sharp bite of early snow. He was tiny, barely 6 pounds, but his cry filled the delivery room like a trumpet. I held him close, tracing his small fingers, and whispered a promise that neither of us would ever be invisible again. The years that followed were hard in the way only single motherhood can be. I learned to feed him on 4 hours of sleep, to code on an old laptop balanced on my knees while he napped beside me. I built websites for small businesses, fixed spreadsheets for clinics, and said yes to every project that could keep us afloat. Sometimes I fainted from exhaustion, sometimes from hunger, but I always got back up. There was no one else to call, no hand waiting to catch me. I remember one winter when the heat went out in our apartment for a week. I wrapped Caleb in layers of blankets, then sat on the floor beside his crib wearing that same gray scarf from years before. The wool had frayed at the ends, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I told myself it was temporary, just one more night, one more job away from better days. By the time Caleb turned 3, I was freelancing full-time. I spent nights learning programming languages, teaching myself to build databases and pitching software ideas to small clinics. Some failed, some barely paid, but each one taught me something new. The idea that changed everything came one night after a client called a system to help hospitals track medical supplies in real time. I didn't have investors or connections, just experience from years of watching how delays hurt patients. I started coding between diaper changes and late-night feedings, my eyes burning from the glow of the screen. When my prototype finally worked, I emailed it to a clinic manager who had once hired me for spreadsheet work. She called the next day in tears. "Do you know what you've built, Laura? This could save lives." Her words stunned me. It was the first time anyone had looked at my work and seen its worth without comparison or condition. The road from that moment to stability was long. There were failed partnerships, bad contracts, weeks when I couldn't afford daycare. But little by little things shifted. Hospitals began using my system. Payments came on time. I paid off old debts, upgraded our apartment, and bought a second-hand SUV that smelled faintly of pine air freshener. Through it all, Caleb grew wide-eyed and curious, always asking how things worked. I never told my parents about any of it. Years had passed since we'd spoken, beyond the occasional text from my mother asking about Chelsea's wedding gifts or family updates that never included my name. Silence was easier than the pretense of closeness. When Grandma Pearl called, though her voice still wrapped around me like a blanket. She asked about Caleb, told me about the birds at her feeder, and always ended with the same words, "Don't stop building, sweetheart. One day they'll see." She didn't mean success or wealth. She meant the quiet strength of a life that stands on its own. Still, part of me hoped she was right, that someday, when they looked my way, they would finally see me as more than the girl with the gray scarf. That hope dimmed a little each year until it settled into something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. Or the calm that comes when you stop expecting the weather to change. By the time I turned 32, I no longer measured my life by their approval. The company had grown, the bills were paid, and Caleb and I had moved to Denver, where the mountains looked like possibility rather than distance. Then that December, my phone lit up with my mother's name. I was stringing lights along the railing of our apartment balcony, humming under my breath, when her message appeared. "This Christmas is only for Chelsea's kids. Don't come." 10 words, nothing more. I stood there in the cold, the string of lights still glowing in my hands, and felt the air leave my chest. Caleb was in the living room counting ornaments, unaware that the holiday had just been rewritten. I typed, "Okay," and pressed send. There was nothing else to say. I walked back inside, switched off the phone, and sat down beside my son as he adjusted a tiny angel on the tree. He smiled up at me, his face lit by the soft gold light, and said, "Do you think Grandma will like it this year?" I smoothed his hair and told him it looked perfect. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, quiet flakes. I thought of Grandma Pearl, of Aunt Linda, of all the years I'd been told there was no seat left for me. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt space open, waiting for something new to begin. The next morning, I brewed coffee and stared at the purchase agreement lying on the counter, the deed to a place high in the Rockies, one that no one knew about yet. A home wide enough for laughter, for people who remembered what it felt like to be left out. I signed my name, and as the pen lifted from the page, I realized the holidays ahead would be nothing like the ones I'd grown up with. What I didn't know then was that I wasn't the only one they had shut out that year, and that discovery would change everything. The morning after that message, the sky hung low and heavy snow gathering on the window ledge outside our apartment. I poured myself a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I touched it. Caleb sat at the kitchen table still in his pajamas, lining up marshmallows along the edge of his cocoa mug. "Mom," he asked, "are we going to Grandma and Grandpa's for Christmas this year?" I froze with the cup halfway to my lips. He looked at me expectantly, the way only a child can when he still believes holidays always mean family. "We'll see, sweetheart," I said, setting the cup down. "We might do something different this time." He nodded satisfied and went back to his marshmallows. The question hung in the air, a soft ache I didn't know how to answer. That afternoon I dialed Aunt Linda. Her voice came through with the same warmth I remembered from childhood, though there was a weary note underneath. "Laura, she said I was wondering if you got an invite this year." I hesitated and she gave a dry little laugh. "That's answer enough. You're not the only one. They told me it would just be Chelsea's family this time." She paused, lowering her voice. "Your mom said it's to keep things simple. I guess simple means smaller, and smaller means fewer of us." We talked for a while, both circling the same wound we'd carried in silence for years. She told me that Mark and his wife hadn't been invited either. "They said it's just about making Chelsea's kids comfortable," she added, and then sighed. "I suppose that makes the rest of us uncomfortable by default." I could almost hear the smile she tried to force through the line. We said goodbye quietly, promising to talk again soon. After I hung up, I called Grandma Pearl. She took longer to answer, her voice soft but trembling when she finally spoke. "Oh, sweetheart. No, I wasn't invited either. Your mother said it would be a small Christmas this year, just Chelsea and the kids. She thought it might be less tiring for everyone." There was a pause long enough to feel the distance between us. "I miss you, Laura. I miss Caleb, too. It's been too quiet here lately." I sat there at the table listening to her voice, feeling that quiet stretch inside me as well. All these years I had believed the coldness I felt was personal, directed only at me. But that afternoon, I realized it wasn't just me they'd shut out. It was anyone who didn't fit neatly into their idea of what family should look like. I wasn't the only one they'd left behind. When the sun dipped behind the buildings, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank document that held my new project notes. The cursor blinked patient and steady. For years I'd lived in reaction, working harder, pushing further, proving what didn't need proof. But now something else stirred, something calm and deliberate. If they had closed their doors, I would open mine. That night I sent 3 messages. One to Aunt Linda. "If you and Mark have nowhere to go for Christmas, come to Aspen." Another to Mark himself. "I have plenty of space. Bring the kids. We'll make our own celebration." And finally, to Grandma Pearl. "You'll always have a seat at my table. Can I send someone to pick you up?" I didn't expect an answer right away, but they came faster than I imagined. Aunt Linda wrote back within minutes. "Are you serious? We'd love that." Mark called immediately, laughing in disbelief. "You mean it, Laura? You really want us all up there?" I could hear the background noise of his kids playing and the excitement building in his voice. "It's a long drive, but I'll make it happen." Grandma Pearl's reply was the last to arrive. "I'll come," she wrote simply. "Send me the address. I can't wait to see you and Caleb again." The words blurred as I read them. I had spent years carrying the ache of being left out. Now I realized how many others had carried the same weight, quietly waiting for someone to make room. Over the next few days, the apartment filled with a quiet, steady purpose. I arranged for the moving truck to deliver the last of our boxes to the new house in Aspen, confirming that everything from dishes to linens had arrived safely. The estate sat just outside town, where pine trees framed the long driveway and snow drifted against the gateposts. It was built from pale wood that glowed gold in winter light, wide windows looking out toward the mountains. I had bought it because it felt open, the kind of place that could hold both laughter and silence, without either one feeling too loud. I spent the next mornings driving back and forth, overseeing the last touches. The kitchen staff I'd hired to help with the move were still unpacking when I arrived. The scent of new pine mixed with the faint sweetness of cinnamon candles I'd placed along the counter. The dining room with its long walnut table still looked too large for just 2 people. I ran my hand across the surface and thought of every holiday where I'd been pushed to the side, seated among children, while the adults talked at the main table. This year, there would be one table long wide open to everyone who had ever been made to feel small. That night, after Caleb went to bed, I sat by the window with a notebook in my lap. I began sketching plans, what dishes to serve, where to place the tree, how to make the space feel like it had been waiting for them all along. I called a local decorating company in Aspen first thing the next morning. The manager, a woman named Renee Carter, answered with brisk energy. When I told her I needed the entire estate turned into a winter wonderland within a week, she laughed in disbelief. "That's a tall order," she said, but I could hear the spark of challenge in her tone. "We'll make it happen." Within 2 days, trucks pulled up the drive, unloading boxes of lights, garlands, and wreaths. The decorators worked from dawn until the mountain shadows swallowed the valley, stringing golden lights along the porch railings, setting wreaths of pine and red berries on every door. A 14-foot tree arrived the next afternoon, so tall that it brushed the high-beamed ceiling of the great room. By evening, the air inside smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon sugar. I didn't stop at decorations. I called a local chef named Harper Ellis, who ran a small catering company in town. Her voice was friendly, but cautious when she picked up. "You sure you want a full holiday spread on this timeline?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I want it to feel like home, something traditional, something that reminds people of what family used to mean." Harper hesitated only a second before saying, "Then you'll have it. Leave it to me." When I hung up, I stood for a long while in the middle of the dining room, listening to the faint hum of workers outside. For the first time in years, the air felt full of possibility. I imagined Grandma Pearl sitting near the fireplace, Caleb playing with Mark's kids, Aunt Linda laughing at something small but genuine. It would be different this time, no one waiting for permission to belong. Over the next days, I wrapped gifts at the kitchen island after Caleb went to bed. For Aunt Linda, a framed photograph of the Rockies taken at sunrise. For Mark's children, puzzles and toy kits I thought would keep them busy on snowy afternoons. For Grandma Pearl, a soft blue scarf made from the finest wool I could find, one that would never scratch or fray like the gray one I'd worn for so many years. Caleb joined in during the day, folding wrapping paper with more enthusiasm than precision. "Are we having guests?" he asked one morning, holding a roll of tape in his small hand. I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, a lot of them. We're making our own Christmas this year." His eyes widened and he grinned. "Our own, like we're in charge." I nodded. "Exactly. We decide who comes and how we celebrate." By Christmas Eve, the estate looked nothing like the quiet retreat I had first stepped into. The porch lights shimmered against falling snow. The smell of roasted turkey drifted through the halls, and the long walnut table gleamed beneath rows of candles. I set each place myself, sliding folded cards with names written in gold ink, Linda, Mark, Grandma Pearl, and one that said simply Caleb. I left the head of the table blank. This year, no one would sit above another. As dusk deepened, I stepped onto the porch and watched the road curve down the hill, waiting for headlights to appear through the snow. I could hear Caleb inside humming as he stacked napkins. The mountains stretched dark and silent beyond the trees, but inside me something bright and steady took shape. For years, I had been the one waiting for an invitation. This time, I was the one opening the door. And somewhere down that snowy road, the people who had been left out for far too long were finally on their way home. By Christmas Eve morning, the estate no longer felt like a new house. It felt alive. Snow lay deep along the driveway, smooth and untouched, except for the faint tracks of delivery trucks that had come and gone all week. The pine wreaths glistened with frost, the porch railings shimmered with gold lights, and the tall windows glowed softly against the gray sky. Inside, warmth wrapped around every corner, the scent of cinnamon and roasted herbs drifting from the kitchen, the quiet pop of logs in the fireplace, the faint hum of workers finishing the last of the decorations. I walked from room to room that morning, checking details, brushing my hand along the polished wood of the banister, and the garlands hung along the stairwell. The big tree in the great room stood nearly 14 feet high, trimmed in silver and red, its top brushing the beam above. Renee and her crew had done more than decorate. They had built a feeling. Every light, every ribbon, every flicker of candle flame made the house look like it had been waiting for this day. Harper arrived around noon, carrying trays and boxes that filled the kitchen counters. She was quick with a smile, her hair tied back beneath a red scarf. "You weren't kidding about making this memorable," she said, glancing around the kitchen. "We'll start the turkey now and prep the salmon for tonight." I nodded and offered to help, but she waved me off with practiced confidence. "You've done enough. Go enjoy that view while you can. By evening, this place will smell like Christmas itself." Caleb ran in not long after, cheeks red from playing in the snow. "Mom, I made a snow fort," he said, stamping his boots on the rug. I crouched to untie his scarf, brushing the cold from his hair. "We'll have guests soon," I reminded him gently. "Why don't you help me check the gifts one more time?" His grin returned as fast as it had left, and he followed me to the den where the wrapped packages were stacked in neat rows beside the hearth. Each tag carried a name written in gold ink. Linda Mark Pearl Caleb. Seeing them together made something in my chest ease. By late afternoon, the light began to thin. I lit the candles along the table, the flame reflections dancing in the crystal glasses. The walnut table stretched the length of the dining room set with porcelain plates and linen napkins folded into perfect triangles. There was no head of the table, this time no smaller table tucked away for children. Every seat was equal, every name the same distance from the firelight. The first headlights appeared just after dusk. From the porch, I watched the glow crawl up the hill through the snow, then multiply as another car followed behind. Caleb pressed his face against the window. "They're here," he shouted, and before I could answer, he was halfway to the door. Mark stepped out of the first SUV, a thick jacket zipped to his chin, and his breath steaming in the cold. "You weren't kidding about the view," he said, looking past me toward the wide porch lights. Behind him, his two kids spilled out their laughter bright in the frosted air. Aunt Linda's car came next, her hands full with a pie dish covered in foil. "I can't believe this," she whispered, gazing up at the house. "It's beautiful, Laura." Last came Grandma Pearl, her small figure bundled in a long wool coat and her silver hair tucked neatly under a hat. I hurried down the steps to meet her. She reached for my hand and smiled, her eyes misting. "It's good to be here," she said softly. I didn't realize how much I'd missed the sound of family arriving. Inside, the warmth hit us like sunlight. Harper's team had set out trays of appetizers, smoked cheese-roasted nuts, cups of hot cider that steamed in the air. The children ran through the hallway, marveling at the tree that reached the ceiling. Aunt Linda stood before the fireplace, tears bright in her eyes. "You did all this in a week?" she asked. I laughed and shook my head. "With a lot of help." Dinner began just as the wind picked up outside. The fire glowed against the stone hearth, while the table filled with dishes: roast turkey with crisp golden skin, herb-grilled salmon, a winter salad with pecans and blood oranges, and warm apple pies that filled the air with their sweet scent. Harper poured the cider herself, smiling at the sight of everyone settling in. For a long time, no one spoke, not because of tension, but because of awe. Then Aunt Linda lifted her glass. To Laura, she said, her voice breaking slightly. For opening the door, the rest of us forgot we needed. Glasses clinked softly around the table, and laughter followed. As the meal went on, stories began to fill the space, the kind that had been waiting years to be told. Mark shared how hard the last few holidays had been without the larger family. Aunt Linda admitted she had almost stopped celebrating altogether. Grandma Pearl leaned over her frail hand, finding mine. "You've given Christmas back to us," she whispered. My throat tightened, but I only nodded, letting her words settle in the quiet part of my heart that had waited so long to hear them. Caleb and Mark's kids dragged blankets into the living room after dinner, building a small fort beneath the coffee table. The adults gathered near the fireplace, sipping cider, as the guitarist Harper had brought played softly from the corner. The air glowed with candlelight and the quiet rhythm of contentment. At one point, I stepped away to the porch, pulling my coat tighter against the cold. Snowflakes spiraled through the air, settling on the railing before melting against the warm light from inside. Through the window, I could see the reflection of everything I'd hoped for. People gathered together, talking, laughing, no one left out, no one sitting alone at a smaller table. For the first time, it felt like the house had a heartbeat. Behind me, the door opened, and Grandma Pearl stepped out, her scarf wrapped close around her neck. "You all right, sweetheart?" she asked. I nodded, just taking it in. She looked through the glass toward the others. They needed this, maybe more than they realized. Her voice grew quieter. Sometimes it just takes one person to open the door. We stood together for a while, watching the lights shimmer against the snow. Then she reached over, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. "They'll see it someday, Laura," she said. "Even your parents. Maybe not now, but they will." I didn't answer. The night was too peaceful to disturb with what-ifs. When we went back inside, the music had grown livelier. Mark had joined with an old guitar he'd found in the corner, and the kids were dancing in mismatched socks. Aunt Linda was laughing again, her eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years. Harper came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Looks like my work here's done," she said with a grin. I thanked her, and she only shrugged. "You gave them the place. They made it home." As midnight neared, the fire burned low, and the chatter softened. Aunt Linda helped me gather plates while Grandma Pearl settled into a chair by the window watching the snow fall over the valley. The children had fallen asleep beneath their blanket fort, their faces flushed from warmth and play. The quiet that filled the room then wasn't emptiness, it was fullness, the kind that doesn't need words. When I finally turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, the house seemed to hum with a gentle peace. I paused at the landing, looking down at the glowing embers in the fireplace, at the shapes of the people who had found their way back together. I thought about the message that had started it all, 10 cold words sent from a mother's phone, and how they had led here to this moment of warmth and belonging. Outside, the snow kept falling silent and steady, covering the long road that wound down toward the valley. Tomorrow, that road would lead to questions, to messages, to voices that could no longer be ignored. But for now, all I felt was calm, the stillness before the world decides to notice what it missed. The morning after Christmas, the light came thin and gray through the curtains, the kind of light that makes the world look new for a few quiet minutes. I woke to the sound of soft laughter coming from downstairs. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw the faint glow of the fireplace flickering across the walls and heard the muffled voices of Aunt Linda and Mark in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs. By the time I reached the bottom, Grandma Pearl was already seated at the window, a mug warming her hands as she watched snow swirl over the valley. She turned and smiled. "Morning, sweetheart. You outdid yourself last night." Her voice was gentle, but sure, the way it had always been when I needed to find my footing. I poured a cup of coffee and sat beside her, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. Caleb wandered in soon after, his hair sticking up in every direction, clutching the small wooden ornament one of the cousins had given him. "Is everyone still here?" he asked, glancing toward the hallway. I nodded. "Still sleeping, I think." He looked relieved, as though the laughter from the night before might somehow vanish by morning. By mid-morning, the house was alive again. Mark's kids chased each other down the hall, their voices echoing through the open rooms. Aunt Linda stood at the stove flipping pancakes while humming an old tune from our childhood. Even Harper, who had returned to help clear up the kitchen, joined us for breakfast, teasing the children as she worked. The long walnut table was still cluttered with candle stubs and a few crumbs from last night's feast. The sight of it made me smile. It looked lived in, touched real. After breakfast, the first text came. My phone buzzed across the counter, flashing my mother's name. The words were short. "I hope you're happy. You've embarrassed all of us." I stared at the screen for a long time without replying. It wasn't the first message of its kind, but this time something in me didn't twist the way it used to. More calls followed as the day went on. First my father, then Chelsea. I silenced them all, setting the phone face down on the counter. Aunt Linda noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Trouble?" she asked softly. I shook my head. Nothing new. She didn't press further, only poured me another cup of coffee and said, "Let them wait. We're not in a rush today." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world glazed in white. The children bundled up and ran outside with sleds they found in the garage. From the porch, I watched them carve bright tracks down the hill, their laughter carrying across the frozen air. Grandma Pearl came to stand beside me, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They'll never forget this," she said quietly. "Neither will I." We spent most of the afternoon cleaning up, though no one seemed to mind. Mark repaired a loose hinge on the porch door, and Aunt Linda packed the leftovers into neat containers. The house buzzed with the easy rhythm of people working together, no sharp words, no pretense. As the sun dipped lower, the valley filled with soft gold light, the kind that makes everything feel suspended. Later that evening, after everyone had eaten again and settled in by the fire, I heard my phone vibrating on the counter. This time I picked it up. 20 missed calls, dozens of messages. Photos from our Christmas had started circulating through the family group chat, pictures of the dinner table, the children playing by the tree, the glowing lights outside the house. Someone must have shared them online. I scrolled through the messages slowly. My mother's words came first, sharp and hurried. "What were you thinking hosting a separate event like that? People are talking." My father followed. "You've made the family look divided. You should have asked before doing something so public." And then Chelsea. "You always need attention, don't you? Couldn't let 1 year go by without making it about yourself." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Grandma Pearl, seated across from me, set down her tea and said quietly, "Answer them. Let's do it together." She reached for the phone and tapped the speaker icon before I could object. My mother's voice came through, first high and cutting. "Laura, what in the world possessed you to pull this stunt? The whole family is talking about it." I looked at Grandma and she gave a small nod. Her voice came calm but steady as she spoke into the phone. "Evelyn, you listen to me. That stunt, as you call it, was the first real Christmas this family has had in years." There was a pause on the line. Then my mother's tone softened, brittle around the edges. "Mother, you don't understand. We just wanted a simple holiday for once." Grandma's hand trembled slightly, but her voice didn't waver. "Simple for who? For Chelsea. For you and Thomas. You left out your own daughter and grandson. You left out me." My father's voice came next, deep and strained. "We didn't mean any harm. We just thought it would be easier to keep it small." I took a breath, my own voice quiet but firm. "You didn't keep it small. You kept it exclusive." The line went silent. In the background I could hear the faint buzz of my mother's breathing. Then Chelsea spoke, her tone tight. "You've always loved playing the victim, Laura. Now you've dragged the whole family into your little rebellion." I glanced toward the window where snowflakes had started falling again, small and slow. "Chelsea, I said keeping my voice even last night wasn't about rebellion. It was about inclusion. For once, everyone had a place at the same table. No one was left out." There was a long pause before my father spoke again. "You've embarrassed us. That's all people will remember." I looked at Grandma Pearl, who shook her head, her eyes full of quiet pride. Maybe I said softly, "But I'm not embarrassed. I'm proud. And I'm free." Then I ended the call. The room fell silent except for the faint crackle of the fire. Grandma reached across and squeezed my hand. "You did what I couldn't do all those years," she said. "You stood up without raising your voice." I looked down at our joined hands and nodded, the weight of the moment settling gently rather than heavily. Caleb wandered in, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. I smiled and pulled him close. "I'm just fine, sweetheart." He yawned, leaning against me. "Good, because this was the best Christmas ever." His words landed softly but deep, the kind of truth that needs no echo. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone by the fire. The phone lay dark on the table, but the silence around it felt peaceful, not empty. I watched the flames shift and dance their light, painting the room in shades of amber. Outside, the snow had started again, covering the tracks from the day before. Somewhere down in the valley, my parents were probably still talking about the calls about how to repair the family's image. But here in this house filled with laughter and warmth, the meaning of family had already changed. The door I'd opened wasn't closing again. Before turning off the lights, I walked to the dining room one last time. The table still bore faint marks from the night before, rings from cups, crumbs from pies, a napkin left folded near Grandma's seat. I left them there, reminders of the moment we had all shared. Tomorrow there would be new conversations, new decisions, maybe even new wounds. But tonight, there was peace. Upstairs, Caleb's laughter drifted faintly through his half-open door as he talked in his sleep, dreaming of snow forts and Christmas lights. I smiled, closing the door quietly behind me. The air smelled faintly of pine and cider. I didn't know what waited beyond that night, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find out. The day after the call with my parents, the house was still. Snow had fallen through the night, thick and soundless, covering every footprint left behind from Christmas. I stood at the kitchen window watching flakes drift past the glass, feeling the soft hum of peace that lingered even after the storm of voices from the day before. Caleb padded in wearing his slippers, a cookie in each hand. "Grandma says you were brave," he said, simply climbing onto a stool. I smiled, brushing his hair back. "She said that, huh?" He nodded. "She told me sometimes being brave just means saying no." By mid-morning, the others began to stir. Aunt Linda was the first to appear, her hair wrapped in a scarf, holding a mug that read, "Colorado Strong." She gave me a knowing look but didn't mention the phone call. Instead, she nodded toward the window. "Looks like we're snowed in for a bit." Outside, the drifts reached the porch steps, erasing the path down to the gate. Mark joined us soon after, bundled in a flannel shirt, his camera slung around his neck. "Might as well get some photos while it's this quiet," he said. "Feels like a postcard out there." The day stretched in slow, contented hours. The children played board games by the fire, Grandma Pearl crocheted near the window, and the rest of us gathered in the kitchen sharing leftover pie and easy conversation. No one brought up the drama from the night before. The silence about it felt deliberate, like a kindness we all understood. Later that afternoon, I opened the family group chat on my phone. The messages had changed overnight. Where there had been accusations and blame, now there were photos being shared. Aunt Linda's snapshots of the glowing tree, Mark's video of the children singing by the fireplace, even short clips someone had posted on social media titled "The Real Christmas." For once, it wasn't about who had hosted the biggest gathering or bought the flashiest gifts. It was about faces lit by laughter, about connection. Mark leaned over my shoulder as I scrolled. "Looks like the story's making its rounds," he said with a quiet laugh. I turned to him, half amused, half wary. "Think they'll mind?" He shook his head. "Let them. Maybe they'll see what they've been missing." That evening, the group chat name changed. The old title, Ward Family Holiday, was gone. In its place, a new one appeared, the Aspen Family. I stared at it for a long moment, the simple words carrying a weight that no speech could have. Aunt Linda clapped her hands together when she saw it. "That's it," she said. "No going back now." Grandma Pearl smiled from her chair, her eyes bright. Took us long enough to find the right home for that name. The messages came in quick bursts after that. Cousins posting more photos, laughing about the snowstorm, already planning next year. Aunt Linda wrote, "Next time I'll make dessert again. 3 pies weren't enough." Mark replied, "And I'll bring the camera gear. We'll make it a tradition." The chat filled with heart emojis and plans. I read each message slowly, letting it sink in that for the first time in decades, our family was talking to one another without fear of being cut off. As night fell, I lit the fireplace again, watching the flames twist and settle. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug beside me, his tablet glowing faintly in the firelight. He looked up and grinned. "Mom, look, it's us." On the screen was a short video Mark had uploaded showing everyone gathered around the long table raising their glasses. The caption read, "Where everyone belongs." I didn't realize I'd gone quiet until Caleb nudged my arm. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Just thinking." He tilted his head. "About what?" I smiled. "About how lucky we are to have this." He leaned against me then, and for a while we just watched the fire, the sound of the wind brushing against the windows. The next morning, the house began to empty. Mark and his kids packed their car, first scraping snow from the windshield, while Aunt Linda loaded the last of the pies into a cooler. She hugged me tightly before leaving. "You gave us something we didn't know we'd lost," she said softly. "You opened a door that should have never been closed." Grandma Pearl left last, her suitcase rolling softly across the porch. "You did right, Laura," she whispered as she hugged me. "Don't ever doubt that." When their cars disappeared down the hill, the quiet returned. But it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful, not lonely. The house felt full, even when it wasn't. I spent the afternoon cleaning up, tucking away the extra dishes, and folding the linens. The tree still glowed in the corner, its lights soft and steady. By evening, I sat on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders, scrolling through the photos one last time. Laughter, candlelight, the snow reflecting against the windows. It all felt like something sacred preserved in pixels. Then another notification appeared at the top of the screen, a new message from my mother. It was just one line. "We need to talk." I didn't open it. Instead, I turned off the phone and looked around the room. The fire had burned low embers glowing faintly beneath the ash. I stood and fed it a few logs, watching as the flames caught again. The rhythm of their crackle matched the quiet beat of my own heart, steady, unafraid. The days that followed moved slowly. Snowstorms came and went, blanketing the valley in new layers of white. Caleb built snowmen in the yard, leaving trails of footprints that the wind erased overnight. I worked on new projects for my company from the kitchen table, my laptop surrounded by mugs of tea and half-finished sketches. Life slipped back into its steady rhythm, yet something fundamental had shifted. Each morning, the group chat buzzed with messages, Aunt Linda sending sunrise photos, Mark posting short videos of his kids' Grandma Pearl, writing notes of encouragement to everyone. It felt like the family had learned a new language overnight, one that spoke in kindness instead of comparison. And for the first time, I realized I no longer felt the need to be understood by the ones who had chosen to misunderstand me. One evening, as the snow fell again, Caleb curled up beside me with a blanket. "Mom," he asked, "are Grandma and Grandpa ever going to come here?" I hesitated before answering. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but if they ever want to, the door's open." He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire. "I like it better when people knock first," he said, half smiling. After he went to bed, I stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill over the mountains. The house was quiet, but it felt alive, like it had taken a deep breath and was holding it just for me. Somewhere beyond the snow, my parents' house stood in the same city where I had once felt so small. Maybe they were sitting together, wondering what to do next. Maybe they weren't ready yet. I didn't need to know. For the first time, the uncertainty didn't hurt. The story had already turned. The weight I'd carried since childhood was lighter now, replaced by something I couldn't name, but could feel a calmness that came from choosing peace over permission. The phone buzzed again on the table, another message from my mother's number. I let it ring once, then twice before setting it face down. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless, covering every old path until only the new one remained. And deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end of the story, just the pause before whatever came next. The following week brought a kind of quiet I hadn't known in years. Aspen settled into deep winter with snow piled along the roads, and the valley wrapped in soft white silence. My days fell back into a rhythm: early mornings working from the kitchen table, afternoons helping Caleb with his school projects, evenings spent reading by the fire. The noise of family arguments and missed calls had faded into something distant, like wind across a closed window. But peace has a way of drawing attention. The calm didn't last long before the world noticed. It started with a message from Mark. "You've seen this, right?" he wrote, sending a link. I clicked it and watched a short clip taken during Christmas Eve, the one he had filmed of everyone around the table, glasses raised light spilling across smiling faces. Someone had shared it publicly, and it had spread faster than any of us expected. The caption read, "Sometimes family isn't blood, it's who shows up." By the end of the day, it had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in beneath the video, strangers writing about their own families, about boundaries, about finding peace after being excluded. It wasn't about me by name, but the story resonated. Aunt Linda called that evening, half laughing, half nervous. "We're famous, Laura." My coworker just showed me our faces on her feed. She said, "I wish my family looked that happy." I could hear the smile in her voice, but there was wonder too. "You did that, honey. You made something good." Not everyone agreed. The next morning, my mother's voice returned through a voicemail, sharp-clipped, shaking around the edges. "You've made us into gossip. People are asking questions, Laura. Your sister's friends have seen that video. How could you embarrass us like this?" I didn't return the call. Not out of anger, just because there was nothing left to say. That night, snow fell hard enough to muffle the sound of everything. I stood by the window after Caleb went to bed, watching the streetlights turn halos through the storm. My reflection looked calm, almost peaceful, though my heart beat steady with the memory of my mother's words. The next morning, a new message appeared in the family group chat, this time from a cousin I barely knew. "We saw the video. It's beautiful. You did what everyone else was too afraid to do." Others followed short notes of thanks and small stories from relatives who had stayed quiet through years of imbalance. Some wrote privately, others publicly. It wasn't rebellion, it was relief. By the end of that week, the old family chat had gone silent again. The newer one, the Aspen family, had taken its place as the heartbeat of something new. Photos, plans, recipes, even old family pictures found their way there. The rhythm of it all felt effortless, like a current that had finally found its natural direction. Still, there was one message I hadn't answered, the last from my mother sitting unread in my inbox. "We need to talk." When it came, the call wasn't angry this time. It was cautious, uncertain. I answered because silence had done its job. "Laura," my mother began, her voice softer than I remembered. "We didn't mean to hurt you." She hesitated. "It just got out of hand." I listened quietly, hearing the pauses between her words, the rustle of movement on the other end. "People talk, you know. They say things. We just wanted to keep the family together." "You mean by leaving some of us out?" My voice stayed even. There was a sigh, long and thin. "It wasn't supposed to be like that." Another pause. "Your grandmother called me after that video went around. She said she'd never seen you look so happy. I didn't know what to do with that. For the first time in my life, I heard something like confusion in her tone, maybe even regret. "We can visit sometime," she said finally. "Maybe talk in person." "I'd like that," I said after a moment. "But if you come, it won't be the same as before. I understand." The line stayed quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "You have a beautiful home, Laura. I saw the photos. Your sister did too." Her words caught just slightly. "She's struggling. The video people keep asking about it." I didn't respond to that. It wasn't mine to fix. After we hung up, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was so cold it felt like glass against my skin. The world below the mountain was white and endless, but the light spilling from the house felt warm behind me. I realized I didn't need to win anything. I just needed to keep standing in my own space where peace finally fit. 2 days later, the Aspen family chat lit up again. Aunt Linda had posted, "Same time next year." Within minutes, the replies came, "Absolutely. We'll bring more pie. Count us in." Grandma Pearl sent the final message, "I'll save my seat by the window." I smiled at the screen, setting the phone down beside the fire. For so many years, I'd thought justice meant confrontation, proving who was right and who had been wrong. But standing in that warm room, I understood it differently. Justice could also mean joy. It could mean reclaiming what had been denied and filling it with something better. That evening, Caleb ran in from outside, cheeks, red hair dusted with snow. "Mom, there's a deer by the fence." He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the window. A doe stood in the snow, calm and still, her breath rising in small clouds. Caleb pressed close against my side. "She's not scared," he whispered. "No," I said softly. "She's home." We watched until the deer turned and walked back into the trees, her outline fading between the branches. Caleb smiled up at me. "Can we do another Christmas next year?" "Of course," I said. "Every year from now on." When he went upstairs, I stayed by the window, the house silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway. The reflection staring back at me didn't look like the daughter who once begged for a seat. She looked like a woman who had finally built her own table and filled it with people who wanted to be there. Outside, the snow began again, light and steady, covering the old footprints in the yard. It wasn't erasing anything. It was renewing it. The past still existed, but its shape had changed. Tomorrow might bring another message, another attempt to explain or repair. But for tonight, the quiet was enough. The lights glowed across the valley, steady and strong. And somewhere far below, I hoped my parents could see the faint shimmer from the mountain proof that the family they had left behind hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned to shine without their permission. The weeks after New Year passed quietly, the kind of stillness that only winter in the mountains can hold. Snow blanketed the driveway, softening every sound, and the air smelled clean like pine and wood smoke. Life settled into something steady again. I worked during the mornings, cooked simple dinners in the evenings, and watched the world outside shift from bright sunlight to long shadows. The house no longer felt new. It felt lived in, like it had finally decided to belong to us. One afternoon in early February, I stood by the window as Caleb built a snow fort near the porch. The phone rang, and when I saw the name on the screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. But something in me said to answer. "Hi, Mom," I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end before her voice came through smaller, slower than I remembered. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "About Christmas." Her words hung in the air, fragile as glass. We spoke for a long while, both careful at first, then a little less so as the minutes passed. She said she'd seen more of the videos, how happy everyone looked, and that it made her realize how much she'd missed that kind of warmth. She didn't apologize outright, but the tone carried something close to it, and that was enough. Before we hung up, she said softly, "Maybe next year we can start again." I didn't promise anything, but I didn't close the door either. Some things take time to thaw even after the storm has passed. That night, after Caleb went to bed, I sat by the fire and thought about everything that had happened. How one message had opened a wound, and how saying nothing for once had allowed the truth to speak louder than any argument could. I realized that silence, when chosen instead of forced, can be its own kind of power. Over the next few months, the Aspen family chat stayed alive. Aunt Linda sent photos of her spring garden Mark, shared pictures of his kids' art projects, and Grandma Pearl reminded us all to drink more water whenever someone mentioned being tired. It was ordinary in the best way, steady, easy, full of simple care. By summer, the snow had melted into wildflowers that carpeted the hills. I took Caleb hiking along the trails behind the house, the same paths that had been buried in snow just months earlier. He pointed out every chipmunk, every hawk overhead, his voice carrying on the breeze. At one point he stopped and said, "Mom, do you think Grandma and Grandpa will ever come here?" I looked out across the valley. "Maybe," I said. "If they ever do, we'll make room. But we won't wait for them to start living." He nodded thoughtfully, the way he does when he understands something deeper than his years. That night I stood on the balcony, watching the sun fade behind the ridge. The house below glowed from within every window, spilling warm light onto the snowless ground. For the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring my worth against anyone else's approval. The people who mattered were already here, or close enough to reach. In the months that followed, invitations arrived for birthdays and reunions, smaller gatherings built from the same spirit that had started in Aspen. Even family members I hadn't heard from in years began showing up quietly, carefully, but sincerely. The circle widened, not because I asked for it, but because I'd stopped trying to hold it together alone. When December came around again, the house looked different, but felt the same. The lights were strung along the porch, the tree stood tall by the window, and the long walnut table waited for new memories. Aunt Linda arrived with boxes of cookies, Mark with his camera, and Grandma Pearl with that same soft smile that never aged. Caleb helped everyone hang their coats, proud to be the host this time. Later that evening, as the candles flickered and the room filled with laughter, I caught myself standing at the edge of the dining room just watching. It struck me that this was the justice I had been chasing, not revenge, not recognition, but peace. A table full of people who cared enough to stay even after everything. When the plates were cleared and the fire burned low, Grandma leaned toward me and whispered, "You know, dear, Not all families are meant to stay the same. Some have to be rebuilt to be real. Her words sank deep, the way truth always does when spoken softly. After everyone went to bed, I stepped outside one last time. The air was crisp, and snow had just started to fall again, each flake catching the porch light before disappearing into the dark. I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for permission to belong and how I'd finally realized I didn't need it. Home wasn't a place they gave me, it was the one I built myself. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me. The hurt had lost its edge, the anger its voice. What remained was calm, steady, and whole. Tomorrow would bring new days, new choices, maybe even new forgiveness. But for now, there was peace, and that was enough. If you've ever had to build your own version of family, I hope you know this: love doesn't disappear when doors close. It simply waits for you to open one of your own. And when you do, someone will always be ready to walk through it. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it, or just think about the people who showed up when it mattered most. Sometimes that's how healing begins.